Welcome back to Yang Daily. I'll be your host, Alex Cheney, bringing you all the Yang news you need to live your life right. I bet you thought I'd left you hanging today. Nope, I'm just that late. But it's for a good cause. We've got a lot to cover from Friday, and one piece is extremely good news. As a reminder, you're on your own for Saturday news. Shout out to our Tier 3 patrons Peter Park and Shay Meehan, as well as all our other patrons. I'll be putting out some new polls and the first blooper reel on Patreon tomorrow, but for now, we'd better get cracking. Even after a single infected person at a single event infected a half dozen people at the White House, they are still not requiring masks on the premises. The determination of this administration to put ego above human lives is unreal. Ever competitive in the race to the bottom, just hours after Trump's infection announcement, Wisconsin's Republican-controlled legislature filed court documents seeking to undo Democratic Governor Tony Evers' statewide mask mandate. They seek to overturn the order despite a disturbing surge in pandemic numbers. Wisconsin has consistently shattered daily records for new cases of the virus, and over the last 2 weeks ranks third in the U.S. in new cases per capita. I don't even know what to say. This is the new Republican Party for you. Drink it in. Surely they'll do the same for clothing next, right? If protecting people from a deadly plague isn't just cause for infringing on people's freedoms, then there's definitely no just cause for enforcing dress codes outside of hazardous job sites. So Trump has been leaning heavily on forest management as an excuse to ignore climate change surrounding the wildfires. So I figure it's worth taking a minute to check the facts. A good BBC article for that purpose recently came out. Let's start with false equivalence. Trump has pointed to countries like Finland, saying that they don't have wildfires due to better forest management, but Finland obviously is not directly comparable to California due to differences in climate, types of vegetation, and land use. But what about forest management? Scott Stevens, a leading authority on wildfires at the University of California, says that dead trees left standing in parts of the state due to drought and disease are a serious fire risk that needs to be addressed in California. John Bailey, a wildfire expert at Oregon State University, says that while prescribed burning has been carried out in the state, it's probably not enough to keep up with the amount of fuel accumulating on the landscape each year. The increasing number of people moving out of urban areas to live near forests also makes it more likely for fires to start and harder to do prescribed burns. And certainly more could be done in the way of fire breaks. So who's in charge of management? In California, the federal government owns nearly 58% of the 33 million acres of forest, according to the state governor's office, which is why Yang made that quip on debate night about Trump being in charge of this. The state itself owns just 3%, with the rest privately owned. Federal agencies like the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and National Park Service are responsible for the upkeep of federally owned land, and private forests are up to the owners to manage. The state also has regulations to preserve air, water, and nature quality, though I did not see any that would do more than delay new forest fire management practices. That leaves the state, which Trump is blaming, in charge of 3% of the forest, and the executive branch, which Trump leads, in charge of 58%. Thus, it would seem he is actually criticizing his own policy and falsely blaming it on California. Trump also cut the budget of the Forest Service. All right, so what about climate change? Rising temperatures lead to drier, warmer conditions, which lead to vegetation drying out and becoming more flammable. Add to that the fact that winter seasons, when it rains or snows, are getting shorter by the year. Professor Stephen Doerr, a wildfires expert at Swansea University, says a combination of drier, hotter, and windier conditions is the key factor in these recent fires. He adds that even in areas where there have been attempts to reduce flammable material in forests, it's not clear how much difference this has made. Quote, "The bottom line remains that the extreme meteorological conditions are the main drivers for these extreme fires." End quote. In short, management is partly to blame, the federal government is mostly in charge of that, and climate change is the driving cause. On that note, Michael Mann, a professor at Penn State University, one of the world's most eminent climate experts, who has published hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific papers and testified numerous times before Congress, says that Earth's future lies with the election because he believes that averting climate catastrophe on a global scale would be essentially impossible if Trump is reelected. Quote, another 4 years of what we've seen under Trump, which is to outsource environmental and energy policy to the polluters and dismantle protections put in place by the previous administration, would make that essentially impossible. It's a political statement because it speaks to the need to enact policies to deal with climate change, but it is not partisan to say that we should act on this crisis. We had 12 years to save the planet. Those 12 years are now 10, except more than 2 years have been lost because in that time, the Trump administration has prevented the world's biggest economy from making the dramatic reductions necessary to keep us on the path of cutting emissions in half by 2030. So now the incline is steeper. It's no longer 5% reductions a year for 10 years. It's more like 7.5%. For comparison, 7% is how much global CO2 emissions are projected to fall in 2020 due to the economic lockdowns. The numbers get unrealistically challenging if Trump gains another 4 years. End quotes. Another 4 years of inaction would roughly double the rate at which we would need to drop emissions to 15% per year. Climate change is often described as a catastrophe for the planet. This is inaccurate. It would be a catastrophe for humans and other life on the planet. The hurricanes, wildfires, record temperatures, all increasing in frequency and severity every year, costing us enormously in money and lives. That's only the start. Even the Pentagon considers climate change our greatest national security threat. That is because we're talking coastal cities submerged, natural disasters on steroids, food production in chaos, mass homelessness and refugee populations, wars over resources. Millions will die. Trillions of dollars will be spent on relocation, rebuilding, and war. Governments will fall. Warlords, authoritarian rule, and terrorism will rise. Chaos, poverty, hunger, and death will be the new norms. Nuclear annihilation will be more likely than ever. This is what we seek to avoid. The alternative is we band together to stop it. We develop mutual cooperation between nations, accelerate technological innovation, increase resource efficiency that results in more abundance, not less. The costs of prevention are much, much lower than the costs of treatment. This cannot be partisan. This is human. We must make the right choice together. Moving on, data gathered in collaboration with Cornell University and the U.S. Private Sector Job Quality Index continue to reveal that the real-time jobs picture in the U.S. is worse than lagging mainstream jobs data indicate. The data shows that a second round of layoffs is well underway and workers face increased job insecurity. As 23% are being paid but not actually working, over a quarter have been laid off a second time, and 36% have been told that they could be laid off again. I advise checking the graphics in the link below. This recession is not going anywhere. An article from the Milwaukee Senate Journal reveals that Wisconsin residents called the state unemployment office 41 million times between March and June in efforts to get their UI benefits. And an audit found that just 0.5% of those calls were answered. 0.5%. That is the performance of conditional bureaucratic programs under pressure. It's a disgrace. And it's largely because these programs were always designed to dissuade people from using them in the first place. This is why universal programs are the way to go. No bureaucrats, no applications, no conditions, no restrictions, no bad incentives, no waste, just money directly to the people on the regular. That is how you build the financial foundation for a strong economy and a strong society. On that point, huge news just came from a new survey from Survation, which found that 4 out of 5 businesses from a balanced sample of over 500 businesses in the EU are in favor of a 32-hour workweek with no reduction in pay. 4 out of 5. I do find the wording of the question to be slightly concerning, as current wages for shorter hours has some wiggle room in interpretation, but this has been a common topic in Europe, and I assume the respondents were familiar with the idea. I knew there was broad support among the populace, but I had no idea that support among business owners was this high. The people want it, businesses want it, let's freaking do it. And let's get a similar survey and education campaign going in the US, followed by legislation for the federal government to subsidize the risk of businesses trialing it to remove all barriers. We're talking about more productivity for less time here, less stress, an extra 8+ hours for most employees to live their lives with no downside. There are so few policies that are this cut and dry beneficial. This needs to happen. Spread the word. In democracy reform, Yang and Governor Bill Weld co-wrote an article that does a good job for explaining ranked choice voting, why we want it, observed effects, and that it's a bipartisan issue. It's a good one to share. Check it out below. If you are currently working in education or have a child who is a student, Humanity Forward is interested in your story. They're asking for short videos sharing your experiences with education during the pandemic to be emailed to them at stories@movehumanityforward.com. In Yang Gang Media, Paget and Matt had a discussion over how Republicans and Democrats can talk to each other. Unfortunately, the first half was really just about stimulus. The one good point I think they made was that the key to effective communication is to begin by assuming the best intent from whoever you're talking to. That's one of the reasons Yang was so successful. He respected Trump voters, who are mostly just desperate for change, and exposed to drastically different facts and narratives than the rest of us. The biggest problem with communication now is in the misinformation, conspiracy theories, and faith-based reasoning that's being pushed. It prevents people from having a common set of facts on which to debate. You get to a disagreement and present your facts, and one side generally just says fake news to anything that doesn't agree with their partisan propaganda, and there's nowhere to go from there because it's literally faith-based reasoning, not grounded in empirical evidence. There's no way to counter it. It's why the phrase about no use arguing religion has been around forever, and that has now been allowed to overtake politics as well, which is why I call it a return to the Dark Ages. I don't know what to do about it other than remove the corrupting profit incentives from democracy and journalism, ban gerrymandering, and enact other reforms that will reduce partisanship, radicalism, and reestablish trust in mainstream media, and fix the economy so that people are not so desperate for change, stressed, and as studies show, 14 points lower in functional IQ. As for the stimulus, as you know, I don't agree with their opinion on blaming the House over the stimulus. In fact, the assessment that they are just playing political games is the opposite of assuming best intent. The Senate has yet to accept anything near an amount that meets the needs of the country. The optimistic interpretation is that Dems are trying to push the Senate to something meaningful. If at some point the Senate comes up to anything near $2 trillion, which I'd think is the bare minimum at this point, then there might be some blame to throw at the House if they don't accept it. Until then, it's very clear to me where the problem is. What's worse about the rising tide of disinformation is that video, one of the few remaining unimpeachable sources of fact, not yet abolished by faith-based thought, is nearing its end as an arbiter of truth. Deepfakes, or fake video, are to blame, and an unusual actor is perpetrating them. Represent us. The Democracy Reform Organization is using labeled deepfakes of authoritarian leaders to call attention to the threat on our democracy. As phony Kim Jong-un says, democracy is more fragile than we want to believe. If the election fails, there is no democracy. Fake Kim is right. And sadly, a failed election is where we're headed right now with Trump. Quick shout out to Chris Wallace, who continues to grow on me. He came out swinging on Fox following Trump testing positive and said to forget the politics, it's a health safety issue, just wear the damn mask. Couldn't put it better myself, Chris. In congressional news, David Kim put out a pretty powerful ad the other day, which is worth watching. I like that he chose the tagline, "All of us deserve a floor to stand on. Let's start building." Gets at the idea that giving people a solid financial foundation allows them to contribute more to society, which has bipartisan appeal. Great news also for Tennessee's Blair Walsingham. She reported that her campaign raised over $125,000 in Q3 which is more than triple what was raised in Q2 from almost 3,000 donors with average donations of $26 each. Tripling is pretty good momentum for one quarter, if you ask me. Go get 'em, Blair. If that's not enough congressional hype for you, Adam Christensen just released an investigation on his Republican opponent, exposing that she has wholesale lied about her background, upbringing, and life in general in order to pander for votes. You don't see political drama like this outside of anything to do with Trump. Check it out below. Finally, if you're looking for some wholesome Yang photos to brighten your day, check the link below where Andrew was caught in the wild buckling up for his morning bike ride, complete with child seat on the back. Dude's adorable. And that'll do it for today's Yang Daily. Bookmark and share the wildlife thread, climate unemployment, UI fail, 32-hour work week, and deepfakes threads, Kim's ad, and Adam's expose, take a hit of Yang's photos, help recruit other organizations to the cause and get everyone to sign the UBI petition, flood Congress and Trump with calls, tweets, and letters using the Resist bot or Income Movement easy contacts below. If you need help, consult Humanity Forward, the Income Movement Aid Database, the Mission Asset Fund, United Way, or the H3 podcast thread. And don't forget to Yang Daily.